Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the meetup, our 251st, being recorded on Thursday, December 4th, 2017 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we've got Pete Freitag, and he's going to talk about protecting your CFML apps with FuseGuard 3. So Pete, thanks again for coming on. Good to have you back, and go ahead and take it away. You can stop sharing and start sharing your screen.
Okay, thanks Charlie for having me. Let's share my screen here. Okay, so FuseGuard 3 was just released last month at CF Summit. So it's been out for just under a month, I believe. And so let's get started here. So what is FuseGuard? FuseGuard is a web application firewall for your ColdFusion apps. So if you've got applications written in CFML, which I would imagine you do since you're on the CF Meetup. This is a product that's going to look at the requests as they're coming in, inspect them, and then make a determination to see if this looks like a malicious request. And how it does that is really based on how you configure FuseGuard. There's lots of different options and different ways that it will look at the request to determine if it might be malicious. And we'll get into more details on that sort of thing as we go along. And so when we talk about a web application firewall, this is different from when you think of a firewall. A lot of times the first thing that comes to mind is something called a network firewall. So that's really just about blocking maybe IP addresses or blocking ports, TCP ports, or blocking certain protocols or things like that. The difference with the web application firewall is it runs at the area specific to the application level. So a web application level firewall is typically looking at the HTTP or HTTPS requests that are coming into the application, and it's not looking at other types of traffic, whereas like a network firewall might apply to things like your mail server traffic and any kind of traffic going over the network. The web application firewall is really just for your HTTP requests. So as a CFML developer, that's really the part of it that you have ownership over in terms of the security. So that's the parts that for your job you want to make sure that that part of it is protected. So it is a commercial product. It's been on the market since 2009. Excuse me. So why are web application firewalls important? So one of the key things that they provide is something called defense in depth, and this is a term that the U.S. military, I believe, has coined. And so what it means is you've got these layers of security that might seem kind of redundant when you think about them at first, but what they add is that if there's a failure in one of the other layers that's providing protection, you've got multiple layers to fall back on. So this is depth of layers that can protect you in the event that one layer is insufficient, one layer has an actual vulnerability in it, things like that. So an example of that, like when you have a door that you're going into a building, it's got a lock on it, right? And then it's got a deadbolt. So why does it have a deadbolt? In case the lock on the bottom is insufficient, and it can be breached a little easier than the deadbolt. So that's kind of the idea of defense in depth applied in a physical sense. So another example is a moat. So around a castle, you might have a moat as layer defense. You might also have, an iron gate, and you might also have guards. These are all different layers of defense, but they all provide varying levels of security. So the other thing that I think is important too, so web application firewalls are for smart developers too. It's not just for people that don't know anything about security. Even the smartest, wealthiest companies in the world, like Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Google, they all have code with security issues in it, and they're always working to improve their security. So if even the best and smartest developers in the world still have security vulnerabilities, it doesn't matter whether you're a good developer or not. Having an extra layer of defense is always a good thing. That way you don't have to bet on being perfect all the time, which I don't think is a good bet to make. Another nice thing about web application firewalls is they provide protection from issues that you might not be aware of. So there might be certain types of vulnerabilities that you're not doing anything to protect yourself against it because you didn't even know that was a possible vulnerability within your application. So that's another area where they provide some advantage. So how is FuseGuard different from other web application firewalls? The key point is that it's written 100% in CFML. So that makes it extendable and pluggable with CFML. When you purchase it, you get all the source code to it. So you can, if you wanted to, you could even mess around with it and have it do other things. But it's also it's written in a way that allows you to plug into it easily. You can either extend certain parts of it or add your own components to it. It runs within your application scope. This provides some advantages as well. So it has access to things that other things running at a different layer might not have. Excuse me. And the other advantage too is that it's portable. So what I mean by that is that you can run it on your local development just as easily as you can run it in production. And it will work exactly the same way on your local development as it would in production. So that has a huge advantage when you compare it to something like a network or hardware-based firewall that you only have on production, and you don't have one for development. So you're going to run into issues where things aren't matching up, and it creates a lot of more development or debugging in some cases. Not to say it isn't good to have additional layers of defense as well. Excuse me. The other point here is that it's only for your CFML application. So if you have PHP or something like that running on the server, it's not looking at any of that. But the advantage here is that it has protections for vulnerabilities that are specific to CFML, which I don't think you'll find in other products, that certain vulnerabilities that are really only unique to ColdFusion that it's looking for and protects against. So version 3, I'll just go over this briefly. If you are currently on version 2 and you're looking to upgrade, it's got 11 new filters. Some of the filters include a geographical IP filter. So what you can do here is, like, let's say you want to block certain countries or whitelist certain countries. So for example, let's say you've got offices in the US and in Canada, and any requests coming from other countries would not be valid for your particular application. Let's say it's maybe like a internet extranet type application. It doesn't make sense that you'd have public IP traffic from these other places. You can configure the geo IP filter to only allow traffic from certain countries into your application. There's also some improvements, new filters such as remote code execution, detection, XML entity injection, and more. Another key area that is improved is the configuration. So with version 2, it was configured fully within a CFC called the configurator CFC. That still works in version 3, and that has some advantages to that approach because you can keep the configuration within your version control and things like that. But the nice thing about FuseGuard 3 is that you can store the configuration within a database now, and that allows it to be configurable through the web-based administrator. It also has persistent IP lists, which improves the functionality of some of the filters, such as the dictionary tax filter or the repeat offender filter, especially if you are on multiple servers. It will allow them to kind of share information a little bit better. Okay, so enough slides. Let's get into some demo of the product itself and some code. And yes, I see Charlie's comment there. Yes, it does work on ColdFusion as well as Lucy and Rilo. ColdFusion 9 and above is supported for FuseGuard 3. If If you happen to be running on older something before that, I'd recommend upgrading, since anything 9 and 10 are both considered end of life. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at this application here. So this application I'm going to show you is actually available on GitHub here. I could probably post the URL into the chat pod real quick for you. In case you're curious. So this is an application that's just kind of chock full of security holes by design. So I use this when I do ColdFusion security training classes. I do like a full day training with this application, and we go through and find all the vulnerabilities in it. And so just to show you, so this looks kind of like a normal application, right? This is a bank's website. They've got a news section. You can search the news for certain things. It's got an about section, different pages, contact form, and a My Account section. You can also create an account here. So on the surface, this looks like an application. You can't see any security holes in it, but as I said already, it's really full of lots of different security holes. I haven't counted them up, but I would say probably there's like 50 or more security holes in this application. And so let's start taking a look at excuse me, some of the holes in here. So for example, I showed you the news section here. If we take a look at the code here, we'll notice here we've got an SQL injection vulnerability. The developer didn't put a CF query param right here. So what that allows us to do is, right, so now what I did here is I did I passed into the ID 0 union, and then I did a union, which allows you to run another SQL statement and kind of like merges the two SQL queries into one result. So with that, I was able to select the usernames and passwords from the users table and output them on the news page. So you can see here the passwords, username, passwords, username, password. So clearly, SQL injection is a bad vulnerability. Okay, here's another vulnerability in the application. Excuse me. If you look at this about page here, you'll notice it says page equals founder.html. So, like, I wonder what happens if I change this to something else. We get an error, cannot find included template. So what that means is that as a developer, or as an attacker, I can go like this, .. / .. / / .. / and I can go above the web root into this config folder here and read this master password file. It shouldn't be publicly accessible, right? And I just see if included that master password file. So that's one of the issues with this. There's another issue too that allows for remote code execution, which is kind of interesting. Let me show you this one too. So if I make a CF HTTP request to this URL, let me show you real quick first. So the logs. Every request gets logged here, you can see. Let me grab that. Okay, so all the requests are getting logged with user agents and yeah, things like that. So if I make a request to this URL, now for the user agent, I'm just doing a CF HTTP call here. I'm just going to say cf So now when I go back to this, you can see here what happened is that CF dump I just put in the user agent was executed actually because CF include executes code. So the path reversal vulnerability here is actually really bad because not only does it allow for the attacker to read different files, it also allows the attacker to actually execute code remotely, which means that they can do pretty much anything they want on the server. Let's take a look at another one here. So there's a file upload vulnerability here under my account register. So it's doing a CF file, and it's relying on this accept attribute with MIME type. The problem there is that the MIME type validation is not good enough to really allow for security. So we can spoof that. By doing a CF HTTP. And then a CF HTTP param. And then just by specifying MIME type here, image/PNG, we can give it a CFM file. Okay. And when we hit this file, what happens is that the attacker gets to run another code of their choice because they uploaded a CFM file. All right, let's look at, so cross-site scripting basically allows the attacker to really put any kind of content they want onto your site here. Right, so if this was an HTTPS URL, you would say, hey, HTTPS, a bank of whatever, and then the attacker can, from the URL, basically say, you know, have a fake login page. They can do a lot of damage with cross-site scripting attacks. So that's another vulnerability in here. And finally, let's look at one that's specific to ColdFusion. It's called scope injection. And the way this works is, so let's say you've got a session variable, session.userid. And if it's not defined, so if session.userid is not defined, what you can do is do something like this. If you can see here in the query string, we've got account.cfm session.userid equals 2. And you'll notice, so I just logged out, right? But when I click on this, I'm getting the account balance of user ID equals 2. Let's say I want user ID equals 3. User ID equals 1. So the key within your code to protect against those is to make sure that you've defined all your session variables on session start and check to see if they're defined using something like struct key exists instead of is defined. Okay. So there's some vulnerabilities that we've got in this application. So what we're going to do now is add FuseGuard to this application and see how it can protect against these vulnerabilities. So I've got the zip file here for FuseGuard. I'm going to just extract that. And then I've got a FuseGuard folder in here. I'm just going to paste that into here. So I just copied the FuseGuard folder into my web application. It doesn't have to go in the web root. You can set it up with a mapping to be outside the web root, but just for demo purposes, it's easier to do it that way. Okay, so you'll find documentation here as well in the docs folder. There's a CFC reference here with all the CFCs in it. They're all documented here that you can go through and figure out how they work. And then there's also an SQL folder. So that's just for setting up the database for FuseGuard. So what you'll do is if you've got MySQL or Postgres or SQL Server, you just open one of these scripts. So I'll just open one up here real quick. And then you're going to copy the script, put it into your database engine, and you'll want to specify the user, default user, and the default password. And then you just run this script, and it will create the database structure for you. So you can see it's just a couple tables. To start with FuseGuard underscore. So if you wanted to even add it to an existing database, it shouldn't really cause any naming conflicts there. Okay. So once you've created the database, you want to make sure you create a data source as well. So what I'm going to do here to save time is just I'm creating a data source in my application CSV file. You can use this .data sources. So I'm creating a data source called FuseGuard here. Setting up the connection string, and we're good. So that's one step, and then the second step is going to be onRequestStart. We're going to take a couple lines of code and paste it into here. And you can see in the zip file, there's an example application.cfc, example application.cfm, and example application script. So if you have a script version, CF script version of application CFC, you can use that code. And you just paste that in. And so once I do that, now I should have FuseGuard enabled here. See here. So now what you see happening is that FuseGuard is blocking these requests. And so this is the default response that FuseGuard will give you, just like a 403 forbidden page. Excuse me. You can customize that in here. FuseGuard views blocked requests. So that's something you can customize to make look appropriate for your website. Okay, so let's just go through some of these. So we try this path reversal one, that gets blocked. The cross-site scripting, that gets blocked. The file uploads, right, that gets blocked because it's a CFM file. The scope injection, and this is a CF specific one, that gets blocked. Okay, so FuseGuard has something called FuseGuard Manager. Which will give you an overview of what's getting logged and blocked in kind of a graphical view. So you can see here the last one was blocked by the scope injection filter. We've got one here blocked by the file upload filter. The file extension CFM was not whitelisted. So the way this filter works is you tell it what file extensions you allow to be uploaded. And if any file extensions are attempted excuse me, outside of the whitelist, then it doesn't allow it, it blocks it. Cross-site scripting, path traversals, etc. You can get a nice little log view here. Just showing you some of your different groupings of what filters are blocking requests the most. Which URIs are getting hit the most, what severity level. So each filter within FuseGuard, and I'll explain what filters are in a minute, returns kind of a threat level from 0 to 10. 0 meaning there's no threat detected, 10 meaning it thinks it's a malicious request. So on some of the filters, it might say like, you know, this may or may not be a threat. Maybe it returns a 5, kind of like a 50-50 chance. And you can decide how you want FuseGuard to handle that. Do you want it just to log those, or do you want it to be more strict and actually block those? And that's all configurable. So onto the configuration area. So you can see kind of a configuration summary here, whether or not FuseGuard is enabled. It has something called log-only mode. And let me get over to here. So log-only mode will actually be enabled by default when you use the database configurator. And what's nice about log-only mode is it doesn't block anything. So when log-only mode is on, it's not going to block any requests for any reason. It's just going to log requests. So that's a good way to start with FuseGuard. So what you can do is you just put it into your application, you turn on log-only mode, and then you can see, based on some of your real traffic, what it would potentially block. And then if you find, oh, we need to adjust that, you can do that. So for example, we talked about the file upload filter. These are all your filters here that FuseGuard has. So let's say on the file upload filter, we found, oh, we have a certain, like a .txt file that somebody needs to upload. So you can go ahead and add that to the allowed file extension list, and then it will allow it. Let me just go over some more of these. So yeah, this is a kind of like a master toggle that lets you turn off FuseGuard or turn it back on again. And in order to actually make the change, you have to click Save and then apply settings. Same with the log-only mode. Fail open mode, what this does is it determines if FuseGuard for some reason throws an exception, like for example, if the database server was down and it's trying to access it, it might throw an exception. So you can determine how you want FuseGuard to act. Should it allow the request through if an exception occurs, or should it just block the request? So fail open means it will allow the request through. If you're behind some sort of load balancer or proxy, reverse proxy server, and the IP addresses are passed using the X_4 header, you can just toggle a switch here to tell it to look there for that. Excuse me. So these mask log values, what these are is, if, let's say, FuseGuard blocks something that was a password, instead of putting the actual value of the password in the log, it will mask it. So it won't put the actual password, it would just replace it with like stars instead. Then here we've got your database type. You want to make sure it's selected properly. And the so this web manager whitelist, IP whitelist. So there's different lists that you can create that have IP addresses on them. So this is kind of like the default IP whitelist. So if you've got maybe your developer machine's IPs whitelisted, that way it only allows IP addresses coming from those into the FuseGuard manager. Okay, so filters. So a filter is what looks at the request and gives it that threat level of 0 to 10. So there's a number of different filters. I forget the exact count. I think around like 30 or so filters that you have available. You can even add multiple instances of the filters. Here's just kind of a full listing. In some cases, that makes sense to do. Most of the filters, you really only need one instance of it. But one of them here, like the variable pattern filter, that would allow you, if you have a certain pattern that you're seeing coming in as an attack pattern, you can create a block for that. Kind of like might be useful if there's some sort of like 0-day exploit and you want to add a 0-day patch. You can use the variable pattern filter to do that sort of thing. So each filter then you can toggle whether or not it's enabled. And then each filter has its own set of settings that might be different for each filter. Some of the settings will be the same for all filters, and then some of the settings are unique to the specific filter. So for example, the geographical IP filter, this one allows you to specify which countries you allow IP addresses from or which ones you don't. So just to give you an example of how that works, I've configured this to pass the IP from test IP. So right here, if I pretend my IP is this right here, we go back to the dashboard here, we'll say the country not whitelisted JP. So that IP address is registered to Japan, and it blocked the request because that was not in our whitelist. So another type of filter is the Project Honeypot filter. So this project keeps really a huge database of IP addresses that are used for malicious purposes. Originally, it was started as like spam bots, but they also now collect whether or not it's like a suspicious IP address. So you can determine how you want to block. Do you want to block suspicious harvesters, comment spammers, etc. The repeat offender filter, what this does is it looks to see if you've got an IP that's getting blocked over and over again within a certain amount of time. It will actually ban that IP temporarily for a configurable amount of time. So what that does is when something's hammering you with a lot of attacks, it will basically kick in something to just block them for a certain amount of time. It can be handy. See some of the other filters that are interesting. So the ID validation filter, this one works pretty well to protect against a lot of things. So the way this works is if you've got a variable that ends in ID, it puts it through a common pattern test. So it will, by default, it's going to allow integers, it's going to allow UUIDs, even like lists of integers or lists of UUIDs. But anything outside of that, if it's passed into an ID, it's going to get blocked. And so actually, what happened here, when we were doing the SQL injection, it actually got blocked by the ID validation filter. It didn't even hit the SQL injection filter yet. Your filters will run in the order that they're specified here, so you can actually move them up or down. Within the list here if you wanted to. Let me see if there's any other filters that might be interesting to discuss here. So the dictionary tag filter, that's looking for repeated like password requests, and if an IP makes too many requests within a specific time frame, the IP gets blocked from those requests for a period of time. So that would prevent somebody from doing like a big dictionary password attack, trying like every possible common password against the username. It won't fully prevent it, but it will limit the rate that it allows them from being able to do that. The file upload filter is very useful for it looks at the file extensions of the uploaded files and will block anything that's coming in with a different file extension that you don't allow. SQL injection filter is looking for patterns of SQL injection within the request, quite similar to the cross-site scripting filter. It's looking at all the request input variables and seeing are there any cross-site scripting patterns. So it's important to point out too that FuseGuard doesn't do anything to your variables. It either, if you tell it to block the request, it will block it. If you tell it to log it, it will log it. But it doesn't mess with any of your variables. So it's not trying to like sanitize or strip out characters or things like that. It's not messing with any of your form variables, because that can cause problems if FuseGuard were to start saying, hey, let's let's try and remove something I think is not good from the variable. It doesn't do that because that would cause a lot of very difficult to debug issues. Okay, so remote execution filter looks for patterns of remote execution attacks. XML entity injection and external DTT are features of XML that, when used by an attacker, might allow for certain types of information disclosure or unauthenticated requests when you're parsing that XML document. So that's looking for patterns of those types of attacks. The shell execution filter is looking at various file system paths like C: Windows, things like that within the request. Okay, so that's filters. There's a bunch of filters. I could keep going on and on about them, but let's move on to another section of what it does. So that's loggers. So you've got different loggers available to you. The CF logger uses a CF log tag, and that logs to the file system. You've got the CFMail digest logger. This is a new one in FuseGuard 3. And what this does is lets you say, send me logs only once per hour, and it gives you kind of a summary, kind of like a digest, like an email digest mode when you're subscribed to a mailing list. A summary of what's been logged over the past hour, or whatever interval you set it to. The CFMail logger just sends an email every time something gets logged. So that can get a little verbose if somebody's hitting you with a lot of attacks. So that's where the CFMail digest logger might be a better solution. But this can be useful because it will get the email out to you right away as well. So you might want to just experiment which one works for you. And then the DB logger is what logs to the database, and that's what drives all the FuseGuard Manager log view. So you can, as I said, so FuseGuard is extensible. So a filter is just a CFC that you extend from the base filter, and a logger is just another CFC that you extend from the base logger. And then you can really tell it to log to any type of facility you want it to. So if you have something you're using for logging purposes already that you want to integrate with it, it's pretty easy to do that. Okay. So finally, IP lists are what drive your some of the filters, such as the IP country list. And that actually you do need to generate from the SQL folder if you run ipcountrydata.cfm. The IP whitelist, you can go in here and just kind of manage what IP addresses you want to allow. You can see some of these repeat offender is picking up some of the IPs that I'm using to test here, and got this counter of how many attacks I have. So I might say after a while, you know what? I'm just going to blacklist this IP altogether. I can add it to my blacklist here. Add a comment. I'll have to look at that issue. Sorry about that. Made some changes there recently, so I'll look at that. So yeah, so that's the overall how it works. You've also got something called authenticators. The authenticator is another CFC. By default, it uses the database authenticator, and the database authenticator authenticates against the database table. But if you wanted to tie the FuseGuard Manager login into a different type of authentication system, there's a framework for you to create your own authenticator as well. Okay. So that's pretty much it for the demo. So as far as licensing goes, the production license grants you an unlimited use for non-production servers. So if you purchase a production license, you can use it on all your development servers, staging, test, QA, etc., without purchasing additional licenses. You only need to purchase a license for your production server. And then from there, it's broken down into two types of license. There's a server license. It's an annual license, which is on sale. I just lowered the price today for a limited time, probably till around the end of the year, I think, and then it will go back to $48 a month. Right now it's $40, which is billed annually. The server license allows you to use it on a single physical server for as many ColdFusion instances you have on there. So if you're doing virtualization or you're doing Docker with Docker hosts and Docker instances, you can use, and you know how many Docker hosts you have to license. You can use the server license in that way. And then there's also the enterprise license, which it really just gives you an unlimited use license within your organization to use FuseGuard on servers owned by your organization or leased or rented. But if you have different special scenarios, just feel free to contact me, and I will definitely answer you as to how best to license it. So feel free to email. My email address is right there on the screen. You can also grab an evaluation copy right there at foundeo.com/security/eval. So at this point, I think I'll open it up to some questions. Thank you, David.
And folks, while you're waiting to see questions and answers, if you could take a moment and fill in the evaluations on the right, we'd appreciate it. So there's two questions for you.
Okay. Okay. The session, did you have a specific question, Robert, about the session hijack filter? And Larry, how well does it work with ColdBox? So ColdBox, we actually have, Order Solution has a ColdBox module. It's that, I don't think the update has been completed yet for FuseGuard 3, but that will be coming shortly. But yeah, it works really well with ColdBox. Okay. Can somebody take over a server by editing session cookies stored on a local machine? Only if they knew what value to set them to. The session ID that matched somebody that was maybe an administrator, which is generally how sessions work. And so I can just explain what the session hijacking filter does. And that was the way that filter works is it looks at the IP address and the user agent of the session, and if they change, it will cause the filter to trigger an exception. So that was actually disabled by this default. Excuse me. And so, and the reason for that is that sometimes you'll find in public internet applications that IP addresses can change kind of frequently, especially if somebody's on a mobile phone. So like they might be at their house using their Wi-Fi network, and then they get in their car and drive somewhere, and then they open the app or open the web page again. Now they're on a different IP address off a cell tower. So that doesn't always work well for a public internet application, but for applications where you're on a known network, like an internet application, it does actually work very well. So Robert, let me get back to your questions here. about, do you need to store CF ID and CF token in CF cookies as well as their member ID? Okay, so if somebody has user ID, you don't want to put that into a cookie and use that as your method of authentication. Because then somebody could change the cookie value and change it to a different ID. Am I familiar with Impervious WAF? If yes, do you consider FuseGuard a comparable product that could replace the Impervious product? I haven't really evaluated it enough to be able to compare it, so I couldn't really answer that. But I would invite you, if you're familiar with Impervious already, feel free to give the trial version of FuseGuard a test and see what you think. Okay. So, yeah, Robert, you're talking about like a remember me password situation. Yeah, so you need to store more than just the user ID. And yeah, Charlie's suggestion of looking at a WASP for resources is actually a good resource for that. And it's actually, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a stupid question. I think a lot of people underestimate how critical it is if you're going to do a Remember Me implementation. It actually takes a lot of thought to do it properly. It's actually a little bit difficult to implement properly. So what you want to do is have some sort of random token that is generated and maybe stored in the database. But the thing is, you don't want to store that database or that token in plain text, which you might think to do initially. But think about, if you think about this token is as good as a password, right, that you're using. So it needs to be stored just like it would be stored a password. So you need to hash it and salt it, however you would store a password, using the same protection in the database as well. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into properly implementing a Remember Me functionality. And if you have a really high security application, you'll notice a lot of times they don't even implement Remember Me on applications that are critical to security. Okay, Robert. Yeah. Good to hear from you. Yep, that's a good point, Charlie. Yeah, as you're updating ColdFusion, you are a lot of times getting some additional security baked in by default as well. But a lot of times, some of those enhancements are just tools that you have availability to use, but you really need to implement them in your code as well to get some of the improvements from them.
I'll just go ahead and get on the mic. So it sounds like the questions are petering out. Mostly Robert. Anybody else have anything other than Robert that maybe you were waiting for things to die down? There you go. And thanks as well, Pete. Those are all welcome. If people got to go. We should also add that it's also easy to get to learning more by just going to FuseGuard.com, right? That just redirects to your site.
Yep, that should go right to the page.
Oh, sorry, I see I somehow slipped an L in there, but it still has a link, so if you click on that. Now, Robert, I see the smiley face, so you're just acknowledging that, yes, this is Pete's product and he was helping people understand it. So somebody could interpret that as a commercial. But hey, I'm happy to have anybody give any presentation that's related to CF. So if people want to see non-commercial presentations, either offer a presentation or get somebody that you know that's given one and say, hey, give it on the meetup. But I'm not saying that to denigrate Pete's talk. I was looking forward to it because I knew that FuseGuard had been updated. I knew it had been a couple years since we'd last seen it. And even though he's the vendor of it, he's the best person to talk about it. And it's a great tool that CF people should know about. I mean, I hope people appreciate how easily with it he showed you could knock out many vulnerabilities. So certainly one can take better steps to do more coding on their own, better practices, better configuration, and you can even hire Pete and other folks who do security, CF security, to help lock your environment down, lock your code down. But it's great that that tool solves the problem so quickly and easily for the things that it does. It does it really well.
Yep, and I should probably add it, which I usually do. Is that, yeah, like you alluded to, Charlie, it's still something more you still do want to fix the vulnerabilities within your code as well, even though you might have a layer of protection in front. It's definitely good to fix your code as well. You don't want to just treat it as a Band-Aid solution. You want to make sure you're being proactive about keeping your code secure as well.
Right, because if you have a security guard guarding your house and somebody takes out the security guard, they can get in.
Yeah.
To use your analogy. And Alex, you made a good point there. Yes, I loved the beginning of your talk, Pete, where you showed all those potential vulnerabilities. And I want to reiterate the comment I made there. If you didn't see it, go back up to the top and get the link that Pete offered for that Bank of Insecurity example application. Because not only is it a great demonstration of vulnerabilities, but he's organized it in a way that makes it really clear for you to see what the problems are. And even if you don't care to use FuseGuard to help you solve problems, it'll give you insight. We should also mention too that CF 2016 Enterprise and ColdFusion Builder 2016 now have that security code analyzer tool. But again, it's for ColdFusion 2016 Enterprise and CF Builder 2016 only. But people should check that out as another tool in digging into coding problems. Oh, and Pete, you didn't mention it, but you've got your developer security guidelines.
Oh, right.
I'm sure many of you, and I'm sure many people already know. And if you don't know, let me tell you, Pete wrote the ColdFusion Lockdown Guide for the past few releases. But he's also, in the last couple of releases, had a developer security guidelines, and that's a separate manual. A lot of people think, oh, I've done the Lockdown Guide, I'm done. It's like, no, that's just, covering the administrative and configuration stuff. That does not cover the coding things you need to do. So yeah, good. Thanks for sharing that. And that's an Adobe document. Pete was, contracted by Adobe to write these two guides. You might want to go ahead and share the link to the lockdown guide too. Sure. By the way, I noticed that's a CF11 version. Is it that you did not update it for 2016 because there really wasn't anything?
Actually, yeah, I believe it will be updated soon for that.
Yeah. But the vast majority, everything it would talk about in that 11 would apply in 2016. There just may be some new things, right? Well, let's ask the author, Pete. Are there some new things coming out? To the updated guide in Slack.
Yeah, once the update is completed and gets published, I'll definitely post it in Slack.
Good deal. And Twitter, for those that don't watch Slack.
Yeah, definitely.
There you go. Excellent. All right. Well, it looks like there's no more questions or comments. We're early, but that's okay. Kind of torn. Sometimes I stop the recording to see if anybody had a question they wanted to wait to ask off the recording, but since we're a few minutes early, I just wanted to open it up. If you don't mind, Pete, if people have any other questions that maybe weren't specific to FuseGuard.
Sure.
Because Pete's a great resource. He's a very generous guy.
Yeah, feel free.
Actually, somebody asked earlier about Imperva's WAF. While we've got you, have you got any opinion on the various both WAFs and there's another class of similar server level protection mechanisms. I forget. There's a name of a new class of them. I actually have them on my CF411. I'll go look it up real quick. But do you have any thoughts on those non-CF oriented, especially cloud oriented protection mechanisms?
I think, like I said, I always think of this stuff as like defense in depth. So if you have multiple layers, those might be more suited towards things that might be specific to your web server operating system level stuff. So they might add additional things that FuseGuard isn't looking at there. So yeah, I think they definitely each has its own kind of unique benefits, I think. So yeah, I don't really try to like compete with those tools directly. I like to say, you know what, you have two tools in place, you're going to have better security than just one. Okay, yeah. So the runtime protection. I haven't actually evaluated any of those tools. I can't really speak to comparison with those.
Okay, well, since there's no other questions, I guess I'll just go ahead and stop the recording now and see if anybody's got one that they didn't want to ask while we were recording, just in case. So we'll say again, thank you, Pete, for coming on. And
my pleasure.
If you have any other talks you think of in the future, security oriented ones, you can see people love to hear about that. So if you want to do another one, just let me know. We'd love to have you.
Great. Thank you, Charlie.
All right, sir.